So everybody's just coming in, and we're going to start in just about a minute or so. Thanks for your patience. All right, it looks like it's just a minute or two past 6, so we'll start. I know there's still people coming in to the session, but we'll start now. Hello and welcome to the latest PediaTrust Q&A Ask the Pediatrician webinar, the COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Ruben Rucoba. I'm the medical director for PediaTrust and your host for tonight's session. Our panel tonight, and if everybody can give a little wave, I know the name is there, but I'll put a face to the name. Our panel tonight includes Dr. Susan Sirota, chairman of the board of PediaTrust and a practicing pediatrician at Pediatric Partners with offices in Vernon Hills and Highland Park. Also with us, Dr. Arie Friedman, pediatrician at Female Pediatrics with offices in Lincolnshire and Gurnee, and Dr. Deborah Gulson, pediatrician at Lakeshore Pediatrics with offices in Libertyville, Lake Forest, and Barrington. Our session tonight will be about an hour long. We want to respect everybody's time, so we'll wrap this up right around 7 o'clock. It will be recorded, and we'll be sending an email to everyone who registered for the event a little later on this week, or perhaps early next week, with a link to the recording. We've had questions coming in for the past few weeks, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. But for those of you watching tonight, you can submit questions either through the chat function on the Zoom call or through Facebook Live, and we'll try to get to some of those as well. We understand that there are a lot of emotions around the topic of the COVID vaccine, and we aim to present the facts as we understand them at this time. But if this pandemic has shown us anything, it is that those facts sometimes change, and very quickly. Sitting here on February 11th, we will present what we know, but by the middle of the summer or even the middle of next week, things can certainly change. So please bear with us. All right, let's start with a general question. Dr. Gulson, can you review immunization in general for us, and then specifically discuss the mRNA technology used in the 2 vaccines that are approved for use in the United States?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Welcome. Yeah, I think that before we get into a lot of specifics tonight, it really is important to really understand the underlying principles of immunization. So let's start with what is immunization. Immunization is the act of producing protection or immunity to a specific infection. And the infection, of course, that we're talking about tonight is COVID-19 infection caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We in medicine talk about 2 kinds of immunization. We talk about passive immunization and active immunization. Passive immunization means actually giving antibodies. And you may be familiar with some examples of this, or at least one example. One example of this would be somebody who gets COVID disease and they're high risk for serious complications. They may go to a hospital and receive monoclonal antibodies against the coronavirus. And that is helpful. But that protection is very fleeting. It lasts just a month or a few months and goes away. So it really doesn't last and give you any long-acting protection. On the other hand, active immunization uses your body's own immune machinery to produce a much more long-lasting protection. And oftentimes that protection is better than you would get if you got the natural infection, in this case, if you got COVID. And of course, your body doesn't have to go through getting the infection itself. And so you will hear us tonight say the words vaccination and immunization interchangeably, and they really refer to that. And some vaccinations, immunizations are nasal, like the flu mist. Some of them are oral, like the old polio or the Rototec. Most of them are injected. And so we call them shots, and the English call them jabs. And most of them work injected. Otherwise, we wouldn't be torturing your kids in our office. We really don't want to. We didn't have to, but injected is the way that they work best. And so let's talk about, just real quickly, mass vaccination really got started in the 1950s. There was another horrible virus, and it mostly affected children. It killed many children. It left many others disabled, unable to walk, and that was the polio virus. It happened to go around in the summer, and so they closed the pools, they closed the parks, parents kept their kids home and lived in fear of this horrible virus. Till 1955, two separate researchers came out and announced that they had found an effective vaccination against polio. And that was really a huge advance in medicine. And you'll probably remember, if your grandparents maybe, the rest of us have seen photographs of people lined up around the block to get a polio vaccine for their child. And little did we think we'd ever be lined up around the block again. And here we are doing that for COVID vaccine. So sometimes some parts of history do seem to repeat themselves. So fast forward 65 years, of course, immunizations, vaccinations have greatly improved. They get safer and more effective every year. So 2020 began, this horrible pandemic was going on, and it became clear all over the world that the way to end the mortality, the death, and the disability, the illness, was going to be an immunization. So over 200 different studies started looking to make a coronavirus vaccination, 100 different companies and researchers all over the world. And one of the things I think is a beautiful part of the story is that they collaborated with each other in a way they really never have before. So instead of being the famous first person to create a coronavirus vaccine, they shared their work. And so everyone could move faster. So as of tonight, there are 10 coronavirus vaccinations, COVID-19 vaccinations, that are being used and are authorized for use somewhere in the world. There are 2 that are authorized for use here in the United States. And those are the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. And these do have specific names, but there's a bunch of numbers in there. So they pretty much go by Pfizer and Moderna. So these are the 2 vaccinations that everyone in the United States who's being immunized against COVID is getting. So how do these work? So as Ruben said, these are messenger RNA vaccinations. And what they do is they teach your body with your body's own machinery to make a little piece of the spike protein of the coronavirus virus. So then your body will make antibodies against the spike protein, and that is how you are protected. So you've seen a picture of the coronavirus, the round virus with those things sticking out. The ends there are the spike proteins. And those spike proteins are the way that that virus can attach to your cells. And then the virus can wreak havoc on tissues all over the body. So if we block that spike protein from attaching, it cannot attack. So what these 2 vaccinations do is they introduce a little bit of information called messenger RNA. And that messenger RNA says one thing. It says, make a little piece of spike protein. And that's what your body does. The messenger RNA is very fragile. So it's wrapped in a lipid layer, a fatty layer that protects it from falling apart too quickly. And that also helps your body to recognize it. And we want your body to recognize it because we want your body to take it up and do something with it. Then that messenger RNA disintegrates. It's taken up by the cell and destroyed, and the lipid layer is too. But your body has gone on to make a piece of spike protein that your immune system recognizes and makes antibodies against, and that's how it works. And fortunately, these 2 are really effective.
Sorry. Thanks, Deb, for that explanation. Susan, this next question is for you, and it relates a little bit to what Deb was just talking about. She talked about the 2 vaccines that are already approved in the US. What can you tell us about the vaccines that might be coming down the road that are, either looking for approval from the FDA or possibly getting approval. And specifically, we had a question from a mom tonight on the chat about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And she wanted to know, is it more likely that children will be able to receive a more traditional vaccine such as Johnson & Johnson rather than one of the two that are currently being used?
Sure, happy to answer that. And I too want to welcome everyone to this Q&A. Thank you for making time this evening. Life is busy and days are long in this pandemic. So we thank you for giving us the privilege to care for your kids, and we thank you for joining us. Dr. Gulson already mentioned that there are many vaccines being developed worldwide. I want to point out to start that in our country, we will have enough vaccines for everyone. There are approximately 330 million people in our country, and we will have enough vaccines for everyone just based on the amount of Pfizer, Moderna, and then 2 additional vaccines that are expected to get approval soon. One of those vaccines is what's being referred to as J&J, short for Johnson & Johnson, and actually being developed with a German partner, Janssen. And then the other vaccine is a Novavax vaccine. So the US has access to 600 million doses between Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and then an additional 100 million to the J&J vaccine, provided it does get approved. And the meetings by the independent review panel that will be reviewing this for the FDA are scheduled to meet on the 26th of this month. So it's right around the corner. And then as backup, we would have access to the Novavax vaccine as well when approved. So I think that's important to point out too. Both of these vaccines are different than the 2 mRNA vaccines that were just described. So these 2 vaccines also have shown to do a very good job creating an antibody response, but they do it in a way that's similar to many of the vaccines we already use now routinely in childhood. And the way that these vaccines work is a complex is made with a virus, and it's called a virus vector, and then a modified spike protein or aspect of spike protein. And that virus is injected by way of vaccine. It introduces the spike protein. And so it makes our bodies think that we're actually having a coronavirus infection, when in fact, it's not truly coronavirus, yet our body is able to make antibody to the spike protein. But we don't get sick from this immunization because the viruses that are used as vectors are actually viruses that don't have the ability to cause any kind of infection in humans. And that's how vaccines work. And we just got a little bit of information about immunology, so I'm not going to go into that. So one of the big advantages of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it is a vaccine that's able to produce very effective immunity with just a single dose of vaccination. So we're able to fully immunize individuals faster because we don't have that delay of time, 21 or 28 days before the second dose, and then 2 weeks following a final dose that leads to immunity. Their trials in 12 to 17-year-olds are actually scheduled to begin this summer. I think it's important to point out that the 2 vaccines we have now have already had trials underway for 12 to 17-year-olds, and Pfizer actually announced last week that they had fully enrolled that trial, they had completed, and we expect to have that information actually soon. If we look at the other vaccine that's on the horizon, the Novavax vaccine, again, it also uses a virus vector. It's called a baculovirus, and that's a virus that only can infect insects. It can't infect humans or other mammals. That vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. That vaccine is given 21 days apart between the 2 doses, and they do not have any children enrolled in any of the studies for that vaccine yet. So to answer the question about which type of vaccine children will receive, I would suspect in our country, since the vast majority of doses that we have are Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and since there are trials that are already underway and completing soon for children as far as, and I'm talking 12 to 17-year-olds, so primarily adolescents, it's anticipated that those are the vaccines that might be given first because they're likely to be approved for children first. And I think, maybe we can come back to at some point. Maybe Dr. Rucoba, you can ask me, I can talk a little bit about if and when we even expect children to have vaccines and what those trials would look like, but maybe we can come back to that.
Right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Sirota. Okay, the next question, there's been a lot of attention paid to the allergic reactions to the vaccine in some patients. And one parent has asked us, my daughter has a peanut allergy with anaphylaxis. What precautions should we be aware of when the vaccine becomes available for her age group, 8 years old? Dr. Friedman, what do you tell that parent?
The most important thing to know about these more severe side effects, which are almost exclusively allergic reactions to the vaccine, is that they're very rare. The current numbers, the percentages of people who are having allergic reactions to the 2 vaccines that are approved are about 11 per 1 million doses. That's a very small number. But those people are largely people who have had severe reactions to food or other products in the past. So the FDA has said that these vaccines should not be withheld from people who have a severe allergic profile, the kind of people who carry EpiPens with them. On the other hand, it should not be given to people who in the past had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine itself or to an ingredient. So because of that, we do recommend that you check in with your allergist just to double check that there's nothing specific in your allergy profile that would make it inappropriate for you to get the vaccine. And then, just be reassured that every site that's giving these vaccines has the capability of managing these very rare allergic reactions. And I think, once your allergist has given, sort of the thumbs up to go get it, that you can go to any site right now that's administering the vaccine and be comfortable that they're prepared to deal with one of these rare reactions. We are saying that people who get the vaccine who have this allergic profile should remain at the location where they get it for about 30 minutes just to make sure there's no severe reaction. People who don't have severe reactions stay 15 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. And as a follow-up to that, we had a question that came in that I'd like you to address, and that is, are people that have gone through COVID already experiencing higher negative reactions to the vaccines? And is that an allergic reaction or not?
I don't know of any data that says that people who've had COVID-19 and then get immunized later are having an unusual series of reactions to the vaccine. So we do know that people who have COVID-19 have a strong immune response. In general, when there's shortages, we've said those folks should wait, up to 90 days to get immunized, just to reserve doses for people who haven't had the virus and don't have an immune response yet. But we do think there's good reasons long-term, particularly as it relates to new strains that might show up that make the immunity you get from the vaccine somewhat superior to the immunity you might get from the virus itself. So we do recommend eventually, when offered, that people who've had the virus still go ahead and get immunized. And I think you could do it with a great deal of comfort that you're not going to have an unusual reaction to it because you've had the virus in the past.
All right, thank you, Dr. Friedman. Dr. Gulson, we've heard from you and Dr. Sirota about the 2 vaccines that are currently approved for use in the United States, the Pfizer and the Moderna. And one parent wants to know, is one better than the other?
Okay. Well, they're both excellent. Let me just share with you some of the data that that the Pfizer and the Moderna studies were able to share with us. So in the stage 3 trials, which are the trials on large groups of people, where half of the people, the volunteers to be in the study, received the vaccination and half received placebo, which is a saltwater injection, they looked at the outcomes after the second dose. So with the Pfizer vaccine, that's 3 weeks between the first and the second, 21 days. And with the Moderna, that's 4 weeks, 28 days between the first and the second dose. And they started really looking at the time 2 weeks after the second dose when you would expect people to have immunity. So in the Pfizer study, there were 20,000 individuals in the vaccine group and 20,000 in the placebo group, saltwater group. And of those, of the 20,000 who got the placebo, who did not get the vaccine, 172 got COVID-19, and 8 in the vaccine group. Of those, when we look at serious infection, severe infection, which is really what we're after preventing, in the placebo group, 11 had serious infections, and in the vaccination group, really zero, essentially zero. And then with the Moderna vaccine, they had 14,000 people in getting the placebo group and 14,000 getting the vaccination. Of the 14,000 who got placebo, 185 got COVID-19 and 11 ended up getting it in the vaccination group, with 30 getting severely sick from in the placebo group and 0 getting seriously sick in the intervention group, in the vaccine group. So when you do that math, that comes out to 90 to 95% effective at preventing disease and nearly 100% effective at preventing serious disease, which is really phenomenal. So if I was offered either of these, which we all have been and have received, I would take either. I think they're both just really outstanding. Now, I know that it came up in a question, about variants, and that's a different topic, of course, because there are some other variants, the UK variant, the B117, South African and Brazilian, and of course the information about those wasn't in the original studies of the Pfizer and Moderna, but they have looked at that since, and we may get into that later, and really do think that they should be effective at least for 2 of those variants as effective. And even if they weren't as effective, those numbers, 90, 95%, are so amazing that even if it was a little bit less effective, that's really quite impressive. And remember, we can always go back to getting boosters if there are variants and if the virus changes that can help us later. There's a slight difference in how these 2 vaccines are stored. One of them is stored in ultra cold conditions, the other in cold conditions, and that has to do with how the lipid layer is formed. But really, any place that's administering vaccines is going to be really careful and store them correctly. But that may change which vaccine is available at which locations. And again, like we talked about before, this little messenger RNA piece of information never enters the nucleus of the cell. So it can't affect your DNA, and these are not live viruses, so they can't give you coronavirus. So I think they're equally wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Gulson. So this next question is going to go back to Dr. Sirota, and that is that one parent asked, will the vaccine be safe for toddlers? And somebody on the chat wanted to know specifically about kids, that are 12 and under. So what can you tell us about how the vaccine trials will look for younger children, younger than 16, and how they differ from those done on the adults? You're muted.
I think we have to start by recognizing that it is important that these vaccines be studied in children. And one of the things that the American Academy of Pediatrics has been very busy doing over these last several months is working hard to advocate and ensure that the vaccine studies do take place in younger children and that they really get underway so that we will be able to vaccinate all of our patients in a timely fashion when we know it's safe. So given how well and how safe the vaccines perform, and you just heard some numbers indicating that in adults, we're really hopeful that we're going to see similar results in children. But, and you all know this as parents, and we certainly know this as pediatricians, children are not merely little adults. So the vaccines really have to be studied in children before we can use them. And so, as we said, we already have information for 12 to 17-year-olds right around the corner, and we will have those results soon. In the UK, AstraZeneca's vaccine has started or announced a study all the way down to 5 years of age, but that study is actually not enrolling children in the US yet. But let me take a minute and just talk about what the approach looks like, because we know what the approach to studying the vaccines in children will look like, and it is going to happen a little faster than the studies have happened in adults. So the approach that's going to be taken is what's called an age de-escalation approach. And what that means, and it's just what we're talking about here, is we are going to see studies done in children in successively younger age groups, kind of chunking. And what will happen is we'll do something called immunobridging or bridging studies. So instead of having studies like the original studies with the endpoint of a study that was just discussed, the endpoint for these studies in children are really going to be to prove safety, most important, and also second most important, to show that they are similarly effective in producing antibody to the spike protein. And then that antibody level, or that production of antibody, is what's going to be used as the surrogate for protection, or protection from disease. So by doing that, what we think will happen, or what we know will happen, is that we will be able to get to that endpoint much faster, in a few months rather than, say, several months. And we will also be able to, in those studies, enroll fewer children. So whereas adult studies needed tens of thousands of participants, the children's studies will only need a couple thousand, for example. And so that's something that's going to allow us to move this process along faster. But let me maybe try to be a little more specific as far as what we're thinking that means as far as time frame. And I'm sharing you information that comes from some of the experts at the American Academy of Pediatrics. We really think that older kids are going to be vaccinated, older kids meaning 16, 17 and up, by late summer, early fall. So older teens, young adults, by late summer, early fall. And we suspect that, and that may also include kids 12 and up by late summer and early fall. We suspect that children under 12 years of age probably won't be receiving vaccine until somewhere either very late this year, late 2021, or possibly even early next year, about a year from now. So I think that's what we know. There was one other question, I think, that's sort of related to, and I think we're going to come to this, like, what can you do when you're vaccinated? Sort of along the lines of, do children need to be vaccinated to go back to school? We know already that it is safe for children to go to school if proper mitigation is put in place. There are many studies that have shown this, without vaccines, and even in fact without teachers having vaccines. Although in our state, all teachers are really in the process of getting vaccinated now. So we do not need to wait for vaccines for children to be able to go back to school safely. And I wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Dr. Sirota. Speaking of which, we're going to turn this next question to Dr. Friedman. The question that Dr. Sirota mentioned came in on the chat. Once parents are vaccinated, what activities will be safe to do with our young kids, considering that babies and toddlers, probably won't be vaccinated for, quite some time? Can we get back to normal, or do we need to continue to stay home, avoid crowds, etc.? And specifically, there was another question that came in related to that. Grandparents who've been vaccinated, if somebody has a newborn baby at home, if the grandparents have been vaccinated, it's been 2 weeks since their second vaccination, can they come and pick up the baby?
There's lots of layers to these questions. And I think, something we as pediatricians can do without getting to the specifics of the question is reassure you that children are doing really well during COVID-19. It doesn't mean they can't get infected, because we've certainly seen COVID-19 infections in our office in children of all sorts of ages. But if you look at how children have done throughout COVID-19, it's very reassuring as a parent and as a pediatrician that they've done quite well. There's something different about children when it comes to COVID-19 and how they do when they get infected, which results in much lower rates of serious infection and much lower rates of death. So, children are certainly a group of people that we think a lot about as doctors and as parents. But in general, in places like schools and going to the doctor's office and going to the dentist, children have done very well. And I think that should be reassuring to everybody on this call. One group of people, children, who is at higher risk for COVID-19 are newborns. That's the case for all respiratory infections. We don't know exactly why that is in the case of COVID-19, but we suspect because they just simply haven't been exposed to the same kinds of infections that all the rest of the children are exposed to, and have a lower threshold for getting sicker. So the one thing that we worry about is that even though grandparents and other family members have been immunized, if you recall, there is still a risk that people can get infected. It's lower. So 5% of the people who get exposed to COVID-19 and would otherwise get infected are still going to get infected, although their infection will be milder with the vaccine. So I would be concerned about having grandparents come over to see a newborn at this point in time, that there's still a small chance that they could carry an asymptomatic infection. It's smaller than if they hadn't been immunized, but it's not zero. And so I would exercise caution. We do have lots of techniques for grandparents to see children virtually. I think all of us on this call, everybody in medicine, is very confident that the world will be a much safer place for everybody as the year goes on and more people get immunized. But at this point in time, if it were my family member, it would be my recommendation that grandparents not come over and meet a newborn who can't be immunized and is at higher risk for this particular virus. The other question that was asked was, what's safe to do with kids? Say, parents get immunized. As we've all seen, this is a very changing situation with COVID-19 in society, and those questions can't necessarily be answered. That was my phone falling, I apologize. Can't be answered right away. If you saw what was happening with schools, oftentimes it was on relatively short notice that we knew schools were going to open up based upon what the infection rates in the community look like. And so for now, our recommendation to minimize the community spread of this virus, which is still very dangerous to some people and is still very common, is that we do not yet return to our normal activities. So, staying 6 feet away from other people, wearing masks, not having large gatherings in enclosed spaces, all of those things I think are still important at this point in time for us all to participate in bringing infection rates down, so that as soon as possible, when the world is a different place, hopefully in just a few months, we get recommendations from the CDC and from the Illinois Department of Public Health and from the Lake County Health Department, those of you who are in Lake County, and all the other local health departments that say it's okay to start returning to some of those normal things. Restaurants just opened up a little bit here recently. And then we will see as time goes on and as the vaccines take hold and as the rate of infection drops, we'll get more and more recommendations about the sorts of things we can start doing as time goes on. But right now, mostly we should stick with what we're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. So the next question I want to get to was asked by somebody on the chat tonight, and a related question was sent in previously by somebody who registered, and that is, what can you tell us, Dr. Gulson, about the safety of the vaccine in both pregnant women and in those who are breastfeeding?
Sure. And this is an important question on the mind of many people. So I think when we answer this, we need to look at what we know to be true and what we don't know. So first, let's talk about what we know. We know that having COVID infection is not a good thing for a pregnant woman, okay? So 6% of pregnant women who get COVID-19 infection will need to be hospitalized for respiratory problems. And when we look at other ways of looking at these statistics, studies show that a pregnant woman compared to another woman who's not pregnant her same age is 3 times more likely with COVID-19 infection to be admitted to an ICU, 2.9 times more likely to need mechanical ventilation, and 1.7 times more likely to not survive her infection. So, those numbers are there. When we look at the outcome to the child, to the fetus or neonate, if a woman has a moderate to severe COVID-19 infection during her pregnancy, there's an increased chance of the pregnancy not making it, a stillbirth or fetal demise, the baby not surviving pregnancy. And then there's an increased chance of the newborn being born premature. And with prematurity comes all kinds of problems for the newborn. And some of those problems are lifelong. So we know that it's not good to get COVID while you're pregnant. We also know that other vaccinations are safe during pregnancy, and not just safe, but helpful. And so, for example, the tetanus, the whooping cough vaccine, the Tdap, is a vaccination that we recommend for pregnant women. And also the flu vaccine is a vaccination recommended during pregnancy. And there's data to show that not only is the mother healthier if she receives these vaccinations, but so is the newborn. After delivery, these newborns are less likely to get flu and less likely to get whooping cough, which of course makes sense if mom's antibodies were really high before she delivered, and those antibodies passed on to the newborn. So we know that to be true. What we don't know is we don't specifically know with these vaccinations that are approved for use that they are for sure safe in pregnant women, because that hasn't specifically been studied. Pregnant women were not included in the initial studies. Now, that being said, there were some women in the Pfizer and Moderna studies who inadvertently got pregnant and did fine. But that's not enough numbers. That's really not enough people to decide that you have statistically significant information. When we look at the mechanism, specifically of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations, the mechanism with the way that they work, we really don't find a reason to think they would be harmful to a pregnant woman. So again, we have this messenger RNA, which disintegrates. It doesn't enter the nucleus of the cell. Theirs are not live viruses vaccines, so they cannot give the woman the actual infection. So we have no reason to think that they would be harmful. So the governing bodies, if you will, in those areas, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, the World Health Organization, the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, they have position statements on this, and they have said that these vaccinations should not be withheld from pregnant women. In other words, pregnant women should be allowed to receive them, and they should speak to their provider. Now, I think the second part of your question, the safety during breastfeeding, is a little easier to answer. It's all the same principles. The vaccines seem to be quite safe, and there's no way we would imagine that they would be harmful. In particular, what the Society for the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine has said is they have said that it just seems very unlikely that any components of the vaccination would even make it from the mother's immune system into the bloodstream and then into the breast milk. And so it's very, very unlikely it would even be found in the breast milk. And even if it was, it's unlikely that it would be harmful. So they have also said that women who are breastfeeding should not be excluded. I think we all know that there's a statement on so many over-the-counter medications and common medications that says, if you're breastfeeding, speak to your doctor. And that doesn't mean all of those are harmful. It means that they never put studies before the FDA proving that they are safe in breastfeeding women, because they didn't do the studies. But we certainly don't think all of those allergy medicines and all of those over-the-counter medicines are harmful. The flip side of that is that we know that antibodies are transferred from a woman who's breastfeeding into the milk to the baby. So we would expect that it might be beneficial.
Thank you, Dr. Gulson. And I just want to mention the last Q&A that we did had an obstetrician and a lactation consultant along with one of our pediatricians on the panel, and we addressed all the topics of pregnancy, delivery, and newborn care during the pandemic. So perhaps our staff, Anjali and Lizzie, who you can't see on the call, can send out the link to that when we send out the link for the recorded session tonight to our last recorded session, so that those of you who are either considering pregnancy or might be pregnant or breastfeeding can check that out. A lot of good information specifically around those topics. Okay, so the next question is one that came in on the chat, and that is about a parent wondering, is there less of a risk of COVID if the child's gotten an MMR vaccine? Dr. Friedman, what do you know about that?
This is an interesting question in general in infectious disease. There are, throughout modern medicine, there have been a number of Studies that have shown that people who've been recently immunized for various medical conditions can have a beneficial effect towards other diseases. That's been observed using tuberculosis vaccines and other sets of circumstances like that. There does seem to be some hints in studies that have been done over the last 6 months that various immunizations might result in an improvement in somebody's immune response to COVID-19. Some of the things that I've read have been the measles, mumps, rubella might be one of these. There was a recent study that said flu immunizations might improve people's outcomes from COVID-19. And there have been a couple other hints of other routine childhood vaccines that might improve people's responses when they get sick with COVID-19. There's a couple of reasons that might be. The most likely is just that being immunized activates your immune system. So, you might lift weights to increase the strength of your shoulders, but you might get some core strengthening too. The immune system has lots of components, some of which are generalized and not just specific for one virus. So if you give somebody an immunization, they may have long-lasting protection against other diseases. One article I read, particularly about the MMR, said that there might be something, particularly about the rubella part, the R part of the MMR, that rubella as a virus has some portions of it that are similar to COVID-19, the COVID-19 virus, and that when you build an immunity to rubella as a result of the MMR vaccine, you might be building up a similar immunity to the parts of the virus, the COVID-19 virus, that are similarly shaped, similarly sequenced. So what does that mean? Well, it might be an explanation for why kids are doing so well. We don't have a good understanding of why children seem to be spared from some of the worst ravages of this virus, but it might be that they've been more recently immunized for some of these problems than adults. What it doesn't mean is that we really think that this is a way to approach keeping people safe from the COVID-19 virus. The effects aren't strong enough, the relationship's not specific enough, and we don't understand the mechanism, why this happens well enough to say that, well, let's give adults another MMR and see if they do better. But maybe that's why kids are doing well, and it's sort of a hopeful thought is that all the immunizations we've been doing all along for very specific problems like measles, mumps, rubella, flu, that they've had some other beneficial effect in this unexpected pandemic, and that would be a hopeful, happy note for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. This next question is going to go to Dr. Sirota. It's a question that many asked over the last couple of weeks. We got lots of questions specifically asking us when or does PediaTrust plan on getting vaccine for our patients? And if so, when?
So the short answer is yes, we plan on getting vaccines. Not only do we plan on getting vaccines, we intend to be vaccinating our patients. Approximately 3 months ago, we actually completed the required application and paperwork that needed to be completed in order to become an approved vaccine site. And that's all of our PediaTrust locations. And we did hear a response that we are good to go once a decision is made that vaccines will be given in primary care offices. So I will tell you personally, I'm very hopeful that we will be vaccinating our teen patients and parents of our teen patients by the summer. I think that's when we would likely get to that group of healthy adults. The decision as far as where vaccines are going and when they're coming to primary care is not up to us. It's actually a local issue, and it may be very dependent on the Lake County Health Department making that decision. At a national level, our country had made a decision to try to distribute vaccines through retail-based pharmacies. And so that's where the vast majority of the vaccines are going currently. And in fact, many of you probably heard in the news today, a significant number of vaccines will again be released to pharmacies in the coming weeks. So yes, we will be giving vaccines. Yes, we will be giving them in the most efficient and effective way possible when we have them available. Yes, we hope to be vaccinating the parents of our patients even before some of our patients might be eligible for vaccine based on age. And I think the bottom line is that in PediaTrust, we've worked very hard at our offices to develop what we consider to be very comprehensive medical homes. And just just like the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends, we believe that these vaccines should be given in the medical home, and we're going to continue to advocate for that locally so that we can hopefully be providing vaccines sooner than later for our patients.
Thank you. And this next question is going to go to Dr. Gulson, and that is somebody on the chat asked, are the vaccines going to be mandatory for children?
Sure. Well, as you know, there are mandatory vaccines for attending daycare, preschool, and school, and that varies a little bit state by state, and that's really important for keeping kids safe. You have heard of herd immunity and how important it is to have the great percentage of people immunized against any disease so that it can't sneak into the classroom and get those 5% of people whose vaccine was not effective in them. So that is why so many vaccinations are mandatory. It's really for the greater good. This vaccination currently was approved through emergency use authorization. There'll be higher levels of approval coming down the road. We don't know and can't anticipate when those will be. So in terms of a timeline of when and if this were to become a mandatory state vaccination, that's probably quite a long time from now. I will tell you that we as healthcare workers aren't allowed to practice our trade in hospitals or at PediaTrust without a flu vaccine, for example, and that is mandatory. However, this has not been made mandatory. So the coronavirus vaccination is highly encouraged, but not mandatory because of the emergency use authorization, just giving people some time to be sure that they're comfortable. But so the answer to that is, I think eventually someday, yes, but certainly not anytime soon.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gulson. Next, I'd like to go to Dr. Friedman. We've had a lot of questions about who is going to get vaccinated in terms of those special care patients that we take care of. Some very specific questions along the lines of a parent has a child with seizures. We've had questions about those who are developmentally disabled. We've had questions about other kinds of diagnoses. And we know that Illinois is currently in phase 1B of vaccine administration, those over 65 and essential workers. Phase 1C includes those aged 16 to 64, so some of our patients with high-risk medical conditions. So Dr. Friedman, in general, what diagnoses would qualify our older teen patients to get vaccinated? Is it as common as asthma? Is it obesity? Is it congenital heart disease, autoimmune diseases? And is the vaccine safe for people with these conditions, seizures, other conditions that I haven't talked about? What can you tell us?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that these are incredibly safe vaccines. When you look at how these vaccines are faring, and remember we had that first group of studies which were done with about 40,000 people combined between the two vaccines that we have in the United States, the Pfizer and the Moderna. But we've also been giving this vaccine now for many weeks, and there are tens of millions of people who've received these vaccines, and there's mechanisms for adverse reactions to be reported, and they're very safe. And the only group that we really think these vaccines have some very low risk for are people, as we talked about before, who are highly allergic, the kind of people who carry around EpiPens, who've had severe allergic reactions in the past. And even for them, the vaccine is considered safe enough to give it to them as long as their allergies are not specifically to one of the components of the vaccine or to a previous dose of the vaccine itself. So the answer to all the questions of, is it safe for people to get the vaccines? And the answer is, in a pandemic where we have a dangerous illness that particularly targets the people we're talking about with high risk factors, it's not only safe, but it makes them much safer than they were before they got the vaccine. So that's why these vaccines were developed and why we have this tier in Illinois called 1C, where people of all ages for which the vaccine is approved are going to be prioritized to get the vaccine. I have a list here of some of the problems there are, but what I would say is that if you have a child in your home who you think has an unusual medical circumstance. In my home, we have a heart condition in one of our children. The best thing to do is to reach out to us and ask. We're happy to sort through that with you and sort of figure out where you or your children lie in these categories. But some of the things, I'm going to look over my shoulder here a little bit. I pulled it up as as I was being asked the question. Some of the things that put people at increased risk are chronic kidney disease, pulmonary disease like COPD in older people, Down syndrome, which is something we're actually quite concerned about. The risk to somebody with Down syndrome, even if they're younger, if they get COVID-19, is about the same as if they were 80 years old. So that's a group we'd like to get immunized really soon when 1C becomes available. Heart conditions, cardiomyopathy, which is diseases of the muscle tissue of the heart. Obesity. We consider pregnancy to be in that group. So if there's a young person who's pregnant, we would want to get them immunized. Smoking, sickle cell disease, the list goes on, diabetes, cystic fibrosis, asthma is on the list of possible increased risk for the disease. So there's a long list. And really what I would say is if your child, we're pediatricians, but also for you as adults, if somebody in your home has a medical condition that just makes them unusual and not mild medical conditions, but somebody who has a chronic illness, the thing to do is to check in with their doctor to ask that question.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. So the next question is one that came in over the last couple of weeks, and it is this: the speed with which the vaccine was developed concerns me. Were these vaccines brought to market too quickly? Dr. Sirota, what do you think?
I want to answer this question, and it's a very important question because I think when we spend our time in the realm of at times pseudoscience or anti-science, there can be this sense of distrust and distrust of the type of companies that manufacture, research, and develop vaccines. So I want to answer this question very clearly. And I want to say that the answer to this is absolutely not. Thank goodness these vaccines were developed quickly, but it's really important, I think, for all of you listening to understand that there were no shortcuts that were taken in the developing of these vaccines. And in fact, every step that's the usual steps that are taken in vaccine research and vaccine development were taken. But the reason that we were able to get to these mRNA vaccines so quickly is a number of, fortunately, really good things came together. First of all, we had a technology that we were able to use, this idea of a messenger RNA platform that had been studied for decades. So we knew about this, these platforms were developed. One of the other fortunate things that came about was that the RNA sequence for that spike protein that we keep talking about on the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the RNA sequence, or what we think of as like the genetic code for that, was actually sequenced very early in the pandemic. It was actually in January of 2020 that we already had that information. So by taking that information, using that information, and then incorporating that mRNA of the spike protein into the vaccine, thus became something that was really manageable to do in a short time. So the speed was really based on that vaccine can be produced very quickly on that sort of platform. It's very different than the other style of vaccine we talked about, which might take more time to develop, to grow vaccine. And we also had a situation where we're in this global pandemic. So speed was of the essence. And so what happened is something we've also never seen happen before in the development of vaccines. And that was many, many brilliant minds and many, billions of dollars came together. And it was all of those things that allowed this to happen so quickly. The number of participants that were in these studies are very equivalent to the number of participants that have always been required to be enrolled in prior vaccine studies. So the size of the study was very comparable. But unlike the studies of the past, and I think this is a really important point to make, is that these studies were very careful. The Pfizer study that we saw come out in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Moderna study that we saw come out in the New England Journal of Medicine, that they were very careful to enroll a diverse population, and that population that had percentages that really follow the diversity of what we see in our own country. So in many respects, these studies were actually more representative than any vaccine studies that we had seen before. I also want to point out something I learned from a pediatrician who's a vaccine scientist, and probably his name is Paul Offit. Many of you may have read some of what he's written, but he likes to point out that it's important to know if you look at past vaccines and severe or serious reactions, in general, it takes about 6 weeks to see if there's going to be a very serious, severe, or safety concern related to a vaccine. And these studies also went beyond that time. So although it might be trendy, or those of us who don't know much about vaccine development might feel like, gosh, this happened so quickly, I'm going to say that we just got very fortunate that we live in a world where there's some amazing bioengineering and brilliant scientists so that we could get to this point.
I guess I'll throw in one comment if I could, Ruben.
Oh, absolutely.
You and I have talked about this offline. There's a lot of pediatricians in our practice, about 60. And pediatricians in particular have an area of expertise in immunizations. We give a lot of them, we know a lot about them. And I would say that almost all of us read much of the material that came out from Moderna and Pfizer about these vaccines as soon as they were approved. And every single one of us got it as soon as we possibly could. So we're really confident in these vaccines. We're really glad to get them. And I think all of us are working really hard to make sure our parents get them as soon as possible, and that as soon as our kids and our other family members are eligible for them, we're first in line if we can possibly get there. So I think that should give you a sense of how people who really know a lot about vaccines feel about these particular vaccines that are being offered.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point to reiterate. We do put our money where our mouth is, and we not only talk the talk, but we walk the walk. Everybody, all of the clinicians, our nurse practitioners, our therapists, our lactation consultants, our physicians, everybody got vaccinated. So there you have it.
And we should compare that to large health systems where oftentimes as many as 30 or 40%, not physicians, but 30 or 40% of healthcare workers are not vaccinated in the hospitals in the area.
Right. Dr. Friedman, this next question goes to you. We've had a lot of questions about the side effects of the vaccine. And I know you talked about an allergic reaction, but as you pointed out, severe allergic reactions are very, very rare. However, almost everybody who gets the shot has some sort of side effect. What can you tell us about those? And specifically, there's some misinformation, I will say, going on out there about a specific issue, and that's infertility. What can you tell us about that?
Let's hit the first one, first part of that question first. There's a nice webpage I think that we can provide. I'll hopefully have the staff put that link up for you, for the CDC, about what can you expect when you get these immunizations. And what you can expect is what we expect with all vaccines. Going back to the first part of this conversation, vaccines are inducing your immune system to have an immune response. And when we get sick with flu or bad colds, a lot of those symptoms are not due to the germ itself, but they're due to our own immune response. So typical responses to getting sick: fatigue, achiness, just feeling under the weather. That's all produced by our own immune response, and these vaccines can do that. So some common generalized symptoms are fevers, fatigue, achiness, and just feeling sort of blah. Those generally don't last very long, 2 to 3 days. There's been some sense sort of in the media and social media that the second dose of these vaccines makes people feel worse than the first. That was actually kind of my experience. I felt a little bit worse after my second dose. First dose didn't feel all that bad. Second dose, for about a day, I felt kind of tired. One suggestion is, if you have an opportunity to schedule it when you have a couple of days off, that could be convenient. There could be some local reactions. There could be some redness at the site, some swelling, and some pain. And my shoulder was achy. I will say that I got the shingles vaccine, being over the age of 50 a few years ago. And that was much, much worse than the COVID-19 vaccine was. So I would say this COVID-19 vaccine felt about like a flu shot. There are some things to watch out for. You know, if you feel really bad, if it's not getting better in about 24-hour period, it's worth calling your doctor and discussing that, because it might not be the vaccine that's making you feel bad. You probably ought to check in if you just feel worse than you'd expect after the vaccine. If you have more than just a little bit of redness and swelling at the site and it's getting worse after a day or so, it's very rare with any injection, but it can happen. You would want to call your doctor to make sure there wasn't a local infection. Let's talk about this issue of fertility. And I will say that as a pediatrician, as a father of 3 daughters, this particular piece of information upset me. You know, we have, in my house, we have family members who have serious medical conditions. We have my parents and my father-in-law are elderly. I'm uncomfortable with things being talked about that really aren't true, that would dissuade people from getting these vaccines. So where did this idea that the COVID-19 vaccines can interfere with female fertility come from? I looked it up. I mean, I read a lot of this on social media. I saw people getting really worried and upset. So I hunted this down. And it comes from one sort of complaint submission in Europe by 2 former employees of Pfizer, who came up with essentially a concocted way that this could potentially theoretically interfere with female fertility. One, this mechanism would do the same thing just from getting sick from COVID-19 itself. So how we know really that this isn't the case is that COVID-19 itself does not interfere with fertility. And these vaccines are producing the exact same immune response that the virus itself does. So if there was some sort of potential from this immune response to interfere with fertility, we would have seen it with the disease itself. Also, there were women who, despite agreeing not to as part of the study protocols, who got pregnant after they got these vaccines as part of the protocols. And again, we've been giving these vaccines now for weeks and weeks. About 150 million doses have been administered throughout the world, and no pattern of female infertility has arisen. And frankly, there wasn't going to be, because there's really no mechanism we know of that could do that. There's one interesting thing is that this potentially may protect male fertility. There is an attraction of the COVID-19 vaccine, the virus, the COVID-19 virus for the testicles. And there's this ACE receptor that is what COVID-19 targets, what the spike protein targets. That's how it gets into cells. There's a lot of that in the male reproductive tract. So you don't want to get COVID-19 if you're a male of childbearing, of fertile years, who's still planning to have kids. And just like mumps, we would want you to get immunized for all sorts of reasons, but one potential benefit is it could perhaps protect your fertility.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. Dr. Gulson, this next question comes to you, and it comes from a set of parents who sent in a question on the chat or through Facebook Live tonight. They are healthcare workers. They feel that there is some risk to the vaccine, and that the risk to healthy adults who don't have underlying medical conditions and to healthy children is greater from the vaccine than it is from actually getting COVID. Now, the parents say they're not vaccine people, and their children have had all the other vaccines, but they're nervous about getting this one. Partly because the mRNA vaccine is a new technology. What can you tell them about making a decision about whether to vaccinate themselves and their children?
Sure. Well, it is true that most young, healthy people, children and adults, do okay with COVID-19 infection, but they don't all. And sometimes it's quite a surprise. So every person who has moderate to severe disease is not predictable. It's not always the person who's the right age to expect they would have severe disease or has some underlying condition that you could predict that this is going to be the one. And I think you've all probably known someone for whom this was the case, or heard about someone for whom this was the case. It definitely is all of our experience that there are surprises. There's multi-system inflammatory condition of adults, of children, and then there are just some people who do very poorly. So it's a scary disease, and it can be surprising who ends up seriously sick. And we know that that's the case. We have, again, no reason to suspect that these messenger RNA vaccinations are dangerous in any way. There's really no theoretical reason to think so. And there's no proof that they are, unless, of course, you're talking about the person Dr. Friedman talked about who's had a previous reaction to some component that's in this vaccine. So, and especially for healthcare workers, you know, you want to be and need to be close to people every single day. And many of them are not vaccinated yet because they're not up for vaccination. So I would encourage you to get vaccinated. And I think that that's also a gift that you give to your patients by being vaccinated.
Thank you, Dr. Gulson. I appreciate that. All right, I apologize. I know we've gone over a little bit, but we've gotten a lot of questions on the chat, and there's still a few more to get to. So I may ask a few more, and so if you can bear with us. I know that our panelists have agreed to stay on extra. For that, I thank them. So Dr. Friedman, this question is for you. It's a situation that we've heard some conflicting information on. One parent asked if a child had a confirmed case of COVID-19, should they get the vaccine? And what is your answer?
Yeah, so again, just a reminder that at this point, there's no vaccine that's been approved for the age of under 16. So Pfizer goes down to 16, Moderna is down to 18. We certainly hope and expect that that will change, but for now, those are the ages to which these vaccines are approved. But say you have a 16-year-old, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and she had COVID-19. The question is should she get immunized at some point? There's no rush. So if her infection was recent, we do know that there's very little chance that somebody that age, that somebody of any age who's recently been infected with COVID-19 is going to be reinfected. There have been some case reports throughout the world, low single-digit hundreds of people, and that's similar to other diseases we consider, that you get fully immune after getting. There's a very rare chance that somebody with chickenpox, back in the day when people typically got chickenpox, that they could get reinfected. But the numbers are extremely, extremely low. So for the time being, in the early months after you've been infected with COVID-19, we believe that you'll be immune. Over the long term, we do think, and we can, it's all in the news, we can see it, that the virus itself is going to change over time, and that there's some chance that the immunity you developed to being infected with the virus might not be good enough to deal effectively with a future strain. The way these vaccines were designed by going after this particular protein called the spike protein, that's the protein that lets the virus into your cells. The way these viruses were designed was to go after that particular protein, and we think because of that, the immunity you'll get from the vaccines could potentially be longer lasting than the one you got from the original, just from being infected. And we've seen that, by the way, we've seen that these different strains are largely and effectively being prevented by people who've been immunized with the current vaccines. So what do we say? We say that in a real shortage of vaccine, people who've been infected in the last 3 months might be asked to wait until that 3-month period is up. But if you're offered the vaccine and you've been infected in the past, we suggest that you get it, because we think that additional protection is going to act like a booster and make it even more immune to COVID-19. So safe to get it if you've been infected, and we do suggest you do it if you've been offered the vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. I think that's important. Like you mentioned and has been mentioned before, the vaccines seem to be helpful against the variants that are coming out. So even though you had COVID, you could certainly get reinfected with one of these variants, and the vaccine would, at this point, it looks like protect you from that. So that's a good point. Dr. Sirota, there's a question that came in from a parent. We're planning to have our 3-year-old start daycare this summer. She is not used to wearing masks for long times. But since daycare staff will be vaccinated soon, do we need to worry much about her mask coming off?
So that's a great question. And I'm going to preface my response by telling the parents who are on this call that from the very beginning, and I think every pediatrician I know would agree, from the very beginning, I have been so impressed with how well young children wear masks and how much they are actually not afraid of adults wearing masks. So we heard a lot about, oh, children won't wear masks, children won't wear masks. I can tell you in my office, the young children are the most likely to have their masks on, be wearing them properly, and not worried about touching them. And not only that, we know that young children, because this is very important for social development, which has potential to be affected during this long pandemic, that studies have come out that have shown that young children, preschool age, toddlers, can recognize various emotions from the individuals around them, even when everyone is masked the entire day. So as far as starting your child in daycare and a child who's maybe been reticent to wear a mask because he or she hasn't been in a situation where they've had to do that for an entire day, I want to reassure parents that children who are in daycare do an incredibly wonderful job of keeping their masks on. There's a lot of social norming going on because the teachers are wearing them, all of the other children are. Sure, from time to time, the mask's going to come down and someone will help them pull it back up. I see some children in my office who like to chew on the inside of the mask, so the mask can get very wet, and that mask is going to need to be replaced. But I want to reassure you that children wear masks in daycare. They seem to do it very easily. And they also seem to be very effective. Again, we have studies that have come out to tell us that there's not a tremendous amount of spread when these mitigation strategies are followed. And in fact, having a vaccine and knowing that many of the adult providers in a daycare are going to be vaccinated doesn't mean, as we've said earlier, that those individuals couldn't have a small chance of still spreading COVID. So it will be important for everyone to wear their masks. And I can assure you, if you're coming into our offices for checkups this summer, or you're taking your children to childcare this summer, we will all still be masking the same way we've been doing for the last many months.
Thank you, Dr. Sirota. Good to know. All right, this next question is going to be for you, Dr. Gulson. There was a very specific question. Deerfield School is planning on going back full-time next month. They have admitted that there will not be much room for social distancing, but they are conducting the saliva test twice a week. Do you think this is safe?
Okay, so let me answer, let me be clear on which part of the question you're asking. So we all know that high school students can be asymptomatic and be carrying COVID-19 infection. We also know they can be pre-symptomatic. They're not sick yet. And because these young people sometimes don't get very sick, they also might just not even really notice the very, very mild symptoms. So of course, that is why high schools and colleges are doing some kind of testing. And so that might be saliva tests, nasal tests. So if the question is it safe to do saliva tests? Yes, of course. So I don't think that was probably your question, but if it was, yes. So the testing itself, of course, is very safe. It's very routine. There are colleges whose students have been being tested twice a week for months and months and months. And it helps. It certainly helps find those kids who are not yet symptomatic enough or never going to be symptomatic enough to know that they could be spreaders. But is it safe if the high school says they can't distance? You know, the Illinois Department of Public Health and does have guidelines as to how schools can operate safely. So I am sure that the high school has really spent a lot of time looking at those guidelines. And just like our restaurants and our health clubs and everyone else is following those guidelines, the high schools have to follow those. So there has to be a certain amount of distance between the students. There has to be masking, obviously, in common areas. And there has to be a certain limit on the number of students who could be in each class. So if you're not sure on how safe they're being on those protocols, I would encourage you to speak to them about how they're going to follow those protocols.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Gulson. Okay, Dr. Friedman, This next question is to you. You spoke about, what qualifies under 1C, the chronic conditions that our patients have or that anybody has. There's a follow-up question that came in on the chat. Does the doctor decide if a patient qualifies to be in 1C, or are there very strict guidelines from someplace like the CDC that determines who qualifies?
The answer is it's somewhere in the middle. We've had some experience with this in our own organization as we've sorted out who fits into these categories. There's two parts of 1C, which is coming up, I believe, in a week and a half or so is when it's going to be activated. Ruben, you and I were talking about this. I don't remember the exact date, but in the next couple of weeks, 1C is going to be activated as long as there's vaccine available. There's two groups. Certainly, there are everybody from 16 and up who has a high-risk medical condition. And then there's a whole series of employment roles that would qualify as well. And look over my shoulder here, food service, legal services, public health workers, people in energy and IT, people who go out into the community to do work who don't work just from home. And the reason why attorneys are there, if there's any attorneys on here, is that we'd like to get the courts back functioning, at least in some level, in person. As far as the medical conditions go, right now in Illinois, those are being drafted. So I don't have an exact answer for you who fits in it, but some of the things we mentioned are people with obesity and diabetes, lung disease, heart disease, cancer, people who have compromised immune systems. There's a pretty long list. What we found is that sometimes there are really obvious answers. So if you have heart disease, and you'll qualify. But there's lots of middle ground, and when it comes to that, the role of the doctor is to do their best to help you and them interpret where you fit in those categories. I can say that all of us are really aware that the role of the vaccine is to keep people safe, and so we're really eager to get it to people who it's appropriate for. And so gray zones always come up, and that's why we always encourage you to call us and help you figure it out. So if you're not sure you're 1C when that comes up, that's what your doctor's for. We want our patients to call us, and we'd like to discuss that and help figure out where you guys belong.
Thank you for that answer. This next question is for Dr. Sirota, and that is, a mom writes in, we're having a baby in 2 weeks. We pulled our 3-year-old from daycare to quarantine. When would you recommend us sending him back with a newborn at home?
Well, first of all, congratulations on your family growing. We love to see that as pediatricians. And second of all, I'd like to say that I think you have made a good decision in quarantining your 3-year-old in anticipation of the newborn coming home. And then what I'd like to do is give you maybe a framework or a suggestion as far as how to go about answering that question. Because I think these questions about what can we do, what can we not do, what should we do as a family, all are very individual decisions. So they need to be made. And I think I said this on a Q&A very, very early on in this pandemic, but these decisions really need to be made taking into consideration the risk of your family at home. So that might depend on, for example, how the newborn's doing when you do come home and how the first weeks of life go for your newborn. But they also need to be made with respect to thinking about what are the risks that you are willing to take as a family, because everybody feels very differently. I see this every day in my own practice, and navigating our way as families and keeping our families healthy, but also balancing things that might need to be done within a family, those things need to be considered. I think so this is something for sure that should be discussed with your primary pediatrician and PediaTrust, or for people who have physicians outside of PediaTrust, your pediatrician. I do think one thing that you can do if you find you're someone in a similar situation is look at the history of how things have gone so far through the pandemic in the daycare that your child is in. How many times have you been notified about a case in your child's daycare classroom? How many times has an employee in the daycare been the source of contact? And if you can take a look at those things and you can take a look at them considering like where we are now, where the positivity rates in our area are far lower. Just last week, there were 25% fewer cases of COVID in children. And so if you can make your decision in consideration of what's going on at the time you have to make the decision, what does your own pediatrician recommend who knows you and your family best? And what are the specific risks of your family that you need to keep in mind in making this decision? I really think that's how you would arrive at your best answer to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Sirota. Okay, I think we're going to just get a couple more. It's getting late. I appreciate everybody's patience. So this next one will go to Dr. Gulson, and that is, should your teen quarantine after spring break before returning to school? I'm assuming that means that the teen went on vacation somewhere and didn't just sit at home. Dr. Gulson, what can you tell that parent?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously we take some risks when we travel. We are maybe in the airport, maybe on the airplane, maybe in restaurants with others. So of course, travel puts us at an increased risk of contracting COVID-19 infection somewhere along the way. The beauty of the hybrid model that the schools are offering is that, yes, your student can learn from home as they did for many, many months for that week period after they get back and keep others safe, just in case they have a pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic case of COVID-19. So yes, I would encourage that. And I would encourage you to do what you can do on your trip to be as safe as possible.
You have a length of time that you think, 10 days, 14?
Yeah, so the recommendation would be at least 10 days. You've got the weekends, and kids aren't in school on the weekends. That's why I said a week. But yeah, at least 10 days, and it depends on your school district. They might recommend the whole 14, and it also, of course, is going to depend somewhat on where you went and how you got there. If you drove in your own car to your own condo and ate at your own condo with your own family the entire time, that obviously puts you at less risk than if you were flying and going to airports. So yes, I would say, and dining out. So I would say 10 to 14 days.
All right.
And I just want to remind people too, because I do anticipate a number of the families that are PediaTrust patients will do some sort of traveling over their break. And in addition to quarantining, it is recommended in many cases, and especially for kids who are already in school in order to be able to go back to school, to have some testing in that period of time too. So I do want to remind everyone that we do have COVID testing, both rapid antigen, rapid molecular, and access to PCR testing at all of our PediaTrust locations. So it would really be important to be in touch with your own pediatrician were you to need that based on travel in the coming month.
I mean, I would encourage everybody who's going to go on a trip to have a conversation with their pediatrician. We used to do a lot of telemedicine visits, a lot of regular office visits, and we're starting to do telemedicine visits for international travel, what vaccines you need for international travel and what precautions you should take. But I would encourage you to do that for travel within the United States. You can know what sort of things are ahead of you, what risks, are out there, and what you should do when you come back. Get informed by us. We do this every day. We really know how to help you out with these questions.
I would agree. And I do want to say one thing. We do know that on commercial airlines, flying on the plane while the plane is in flight is actually almost safer than going to an office building. The CDC recommends 6 air changes per hour, to be safe in terms of cleaning the air of viruses. On most commercial air flights, that number is 10. So it's well above the CDC guidelines. In most office buildings, because they are designed to be energy efficient and not necessarily to keep us healthy, those air changes per hour are less than 1. And in the newest buildings, the most energy efficient, they're often 0.1. So that leads to sick building syndrome. And so flying on an airplane, often safer than actually going into an office building. Having said that, I will tell you, and this is a tip for everybody who may be traveling by air, that is when the ventilation system is actively running, which is during the flight. However, that system is not usually running while you're boarding. So I know the usual plan is to get on early so you can put all your carry-ons safely stowed away and then just sit there and watch everybody else filter past. But in this case, in a pandemic, I would say try and not board until the very end of boarding if you can. That might keep you a little bit safer. The airport, on the other hand, is often a risk factor. So if you can stay away from the restaurants, the bars, try and stay away from going into 5 or 6 different shops. I know you probably need a bottle of water to drink on the plane. So sure, go ahead and buy that. But in and out of these stores as quickly as possible. If you need to eat, grab something, go sit by yourself somewhere or with your family somewhere, not in the restaurant and not in a crowded space, and enjoy a meal that way before you get on the flight. Those are some tips if you're going to travel by air. Okay, we got one more question, and this is going to go to Dr. Friedman. A parent writes, you have mentioned the kids are not getting as sick with COVID. Is there any data about children getting sick from the UK or South African variants?
So yeah, I'm going to reiterate. Children are relatively protected from serious outcomes with COVID-19, but they're not completely protected. We've had patients in our practice hospitalized with COVID-19. And one interesting thing about COVID-19 is that although the overall hospitalization rate for children is much lower than adults, when they end up in the hospital, they do tend to end up in the ICU more often. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. We might be more careful with children. Children might be able to maintain their respiratory status really well for a really long time and then collapse at the last minute and end up in the ICU. But again, it's not completely safe to get COVID-19 even when you're young. Just safer than if you're elderly or have one of these severe medical conditions. There are a lot of variants out there, a lot of strains that are showing up. That's inevitable. Every living thing mutates. So this virus is no different. So we'll continue to see new strains as time goes on. The more people who get immunized, the less disease will be out there, the less chance we'll have to reproduce and mutate, which is why we're trying to get everybody immunized as soon as we can. So hopefully it'll slow down. But there are several variants out there. One characteristic they seem to have in common is that they tend to be more infectious. And that's been happening since the pandemic began. The COVID-19 strain that's throughout the United States right now is probably a strain that got here after the pandemic began and became dominant because it's more infectious. So for children and adults, you hear about the common names, the UK variant, the South African variant, there's a California variant. All of these seem to be more infectious, and maybe the California variant is particularly more infectious in kids. So people are more likely to get it, which is why we really want to see about getting this whole thing stomped down with vaccines as soon as possible. The question of are they more dangerous for people has not been fully answered. The South African variant does appear to be mildly more dangerous. People are getting more sick and having poor outcomes, maybe 15% more likely than with the other variants out there. But these are largely based on models. We don't know the answer. What we do know is that there's no place in the world where COVID-19 is commonly seen where children are being affected much worse than they are in other parts of the world. So we don't know the exact answer. We might find later on that one of these strains is mildly more dangerous for everybody or for particularly children. Don't have a good answer, but if you want the answer to how do we stop these strains from showing up, it's to get as many people immunized as soon as possible so that this thing can slow down.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. That's helpful. All right, so it's been an hour and a half. We went about 30 minutes past our time, but most of you stayed on. Very few of you left. So I appreciate you sticking around. I appreciate especially our panelists for sticking around, Dr. Gulson, Dr. Sirota, Dr. Friedman. I want to thank our two PediaTrust employees who are doing a lot of the work and heavy lifting behind the scenes. You don't see them, Anjali and Lizzie, thank you very much. We will be sending out, as a reminder, we will be sending out a link to everybody who registered via email with the link to the recorded session and some of the other links that we've referenced in the chat tonight if you weren't able to copy them. And that should be going out soon. Thank you. I hope that this was informative for all of you. It seems like it. There were a lot of questions tonight on the live chat, and I'm glad that we were able to get to most of them. So everybody stay warm, stay safe, and remember, if you take one message away, the vaccines are safe, they're effective, and if you're offered one, take it. Any other parting comments from our three panelists?
I would say the same thing. When it's your turn, take the vaccine. And I think one thing we might not have specifically mentioned is most of the counties now in Illinois and the counties where we practice all have some sort of online mechanism for families to sign up. And regardless of the age of your children and your age as parents, we would encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to those portals and sign your family up. So when it's your turn, you'll get your vaccine. It's quite possible for us to be able to vaccinate you. You will need to be registered in those systems. So put that on your list of many other things to try to get to this weekend.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Again, stay safe and stay warm. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.